Day 584, Tuesday, January 28th, Daniel 3, Daniel 3 1-30, NKJV. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. And they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Daily Deep Dive. The UCG reading plan states, Some historians believe that the language used in this chapter shows that the story occurred many years after the incidents in chapter 2. While this part of the book was written in Aramaic, the international language in use throughout the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the terms used for the various office bearers were Persian, not Babylonian, indicating that Daniel wrote the story many years later, after Babylon's fall to Persia, using Persian equivalents for the various officers to make them understandable to the Jewish readers of that time. We must remember that the early part of the book of Daniel is not a contiguous narrative, but a collection of independent accounts from the life of Daniel. Chapter contains one of these separate accounts. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar didn't really get the point from Daniel's interpretation of his dream that there is only one true God. As this chapter opens, the king decides to build a huge, idolatrous image or statue. There's no indication that the image was of the king himself. It may have been a representation of his patron god Nebo, or Nabu. The people's prostration before Nebo would amount to a pledge of allegiance to his viceroy, Nabuchodonosor, i.e. Nebuchadnezzar. Expositor's Bible Commentary, note on verse 1. The construction was quite large, measuring 60 cubits high and 6 cubits across. A cubit in Israel was approximately 18 inches. In Babylon it was about 20 inches. Therefore Nebuchadnezzar's image was 90 to 100 feet tall. The 10:1 ratio of height to width, however, suggests that the image was standing on a high pedestal, so that the proportions of the figure itself would be closer to the normal ratio of about 4:1. Nelson Study Bible, note on verse 1. That would mean it was perhaps a 40-foot-high statue on a 60-foot-high pedestal, still mammoth and imposing. Alternatively, some have seen the dimensions as suggestive of an obelisk or some other phallic image. Whatever the case, the construction was lavished with wealth, being made of gold, or at least overlaid with gold, the latter seeming more likely given its great size. The nature of the image is not relevant to the main focus of the story. If it had been important, the account would have been more specific. Whatever the image, most Babylonians were expected to bow down and worship it, including all the Jewish exiles. Just how many Jews refused to worship it is not known, since the Bible only records the story of Daniel's 3 friends. But it seems logical to assume that this was just what the locals were waiting for, a chance to get rid of their Jewish overlords. After all, the Jews were the captives. They were supposed to be beneath the Chaldeans, not in positions over them. Whatever the reason for singling out these 3, it was to become a major lesson once again for Nebuchadnezzar and no doubt the rest of the Jews in Babylon. Many have wondered why Daniel wasn't accused with his 3 friends. The Expositor's Bible Commentary lists 6 possible reasons. 1. Since Daniel is not mentioned in this chapter, he may have been absent from Babylon at the time, perhaps on government business in some other part of the kingdom. 2. He may have been closeted with other members of the king's cabinet, working on legalistic or military plans. He may have been too ill to attend the public ceremony. We know from Daniel that sickness occasionally interfered with his carrying on with government business, cf. Also Daniel 7:28, Daniel 10:8. It may simply have been assumed that as the king's vizier prime minister for his responsibilities amounted to that status, cf. 248, he was not required to make public demonstration of his loyalty by worshipping the image of his god. After all, there is no indication that Nebuchadnezzar himself bowed down to the image. It may have been that he simply sat on his royal dais surveying the scene, with his closest friends and advisors at his side. It is true that Daniel's office as ruler over the capital province of Babylon, Daniel 2:48, was not specifically listed in the 7 categories of public officials, cf. 3:3, though of course the rulers of subordinate provinces were required to be on hand, and none of the wise men Hakimiah, over whom Daniel had been made chief, were included in the call for this public ceremony. As a type of accredited clergy serving under the state, they may have been exempted from this act of allegiance. Their religious commitment would be presumed to be beyond question. In other words, Daniel did not belong to any of the special groups of jurists, advisors, financial experts, or political leaders included in the terms of the call. Perhaps Daniel's reputation as a diviner was so formidable that even the jealous Chaldeans did not dare attack him before the king. Note on verses 16 to 18. Here we also have another proof of genuineness. Commentator Ford makes the following observation. Had the story been the invention that many have suggested, had it originated in the days of the Maccabees to nerve the faithful against Gentile oppression, it is unlikely that the chief hero would have been omitted. Reality transcends fiction, and the very incompleteness of this account testifies to its fidelity. It is hard to see how the force of this deduction can be successfully evaded. There is no psychological reason for an idealizing romancer to leave Daniel out of this exciting episode. The only way to account for this omission is that in point of fact he was not personally in attendance at this important function. Same note. Returning to the story, consider the enormity of the spectacle. A towering golden statue looms over the pageantry as a magnificent orchestra starts playing, giving the signal for the worship to commence. The music is powerful enough to signal worship to everyone in Babylon. Incidentally, leading the orchestra are the 6 most common instruments of the day as well as all kinds of music. Daniel's 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, referred to by their Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are ready to die for their beliefs. There is no way they will bow down to the image. Now Judah's enemies in Babylon get their chance. They report the disobedience to the king, and he takes immediate action, summoning them to appear before him and explain their disobedience to his edict. They demonstrate what the apostles were to teach many years later. We ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. They tell the king that their God is able to deliver them from harm, but even if he chooses not to, they were willing to die rather than disobey God by worshiping the image. Job had made a similar statement many years before, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." Job 13:15. Like the Apostle Paul's sufferings many years later, their example of faith will be a marvelous lesson to all mankind. Compare 2 Corinthians 4:2-12, Hebrews 11:35-37. These courageous young men were willing to give their lives if necessary to show loyalty to God alone. Appreciating their devotion, God spared their lives in a powerful and miraculous witness to King Nebuchadnezzar verses 19-30. The faith and faithfulness of these young men remains an enduring example of respect for God. Their example should inspire all of us to honor our Creator with a similar sense of loyalty and dedication. Holidays or holy days, does it matter which days we keep? P. 22. These 3 young men put their lives on the line when they chose not to bow before King Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. They did not know whether God would intervene to save their lives or not. They knew God could, but they didn't know that He would. Regardless of the outcome, their living faith convicted them to put God first, a principle Jesus emphasized during His earthly ministry. Matthew. Godly belief inevitably leads to doing. This is why we read in James that faith without works is dead. James 2:14-26. Living faith comes by doing what God says is good and right, and being willing to accept whatever results may come from our actions. The examples and testimonies of the men and women we read about in Hebrews show us we can believe God. He does not lie. Titus 1:2. And as our loving, faithful Father, He delights in providing for us. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. James 1:17-18. You can have living faith. pp. 18-20. The Jews' open defiance of Nebuchadnezzar only makes his anger worse, and he gives what seem to be absurd orders concerning their execution. Given that the furnace would have been designed for smelting, it would have already been hot enough to consume the men, but he orders additional bellows under it to make it 7 times hotter than usual. To make sure that they will be engulfed in flame and won't escape, he leaves them fully clothed even with their hats on, and then binds them before having them thrown into the furnace. The furnace is so hot that even the men who threw them in were killed. Apparently there was no door or screen to hide the inside of the furnace from view. Judging from BAS reliefs, it would seem that Mesopotamian smelting furnaces tended to be like an old-fashioned glass milk bottle in shape, with a large opening for the insertion of the ore to be smelted, and a smaller aperture at ground level for the admission of wood and charcoal to furnish the heat. There must have been 2 or more smaller holes at this same level to permit the insertion of pipes connected with large bellows, when it was desired to raise the temperature beyond what the flue or chimney would produce. Undoubtedly the furnace itself was fashioned of very thick adobe, resistant to intense heat. The large upper door was probably raised above the level of the firebed so that the metal smelted from the ore would spill on the ground in case the crucibles were upset. So the text says v23, that the 3 fell down Nepalu into the fire. Apart from the swirling flames and smoke then, they were quite visible to an outside observer though, like the king, he would have to stand at a distance. Expositors note on verses 19-23. Nebuchadnezzar and no doubt all those with him are astonished. Not only do they see the 3 walking around inside the furnace, no longer tied up, but with them is a 4th person, whom Nebuchadnezzar says is like a son of God's. The New King James Version translates this as the Son of God, but this is misleading because it is the king who says this, and he doesn't know anything about the real Son of God. The Babylonians believed in multiple gods, and the language of the original Aramaic literally means like a son of gods. The Bible doesn't tell us what he really saw. It may have been an angel, it may have been the pre-incarnate Christ, or it may have been a divinely created apparition. Whatever Nebuchadnezzar saw, it must not have appeared as a mere ordinary person for him to think it godlike. When the 3 men come out, this 4th does not, having apparently disappeared. Once again the king is stopped in his tracks. But although he knows that the Jews have a very powerful God, he still doesn't recognize that the God of the Jews is the only God. Verses 2829. That lesson is still to come. At this point, God is the God of the Jews, not the God of Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar is highly impressed and wants to honor their God, while at the same time emphasizing his own authority by issuing another extreme decree, verse 29. And the 3 Jews are promoted, obviously to the chagrin of their enemies, verse 30. Thus we see God's ironic and poetic justice. The 3 men, literally thrown into a refiner's fire, could well have quoted the words of King David, which he meant only figuratively. For you, O God, have tested us. You have refined us as silver is refined. You brought us into the net. You laid affliction on our backs. You have caused men to ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, but you brought us out to rich fulfillment. Psalm 66:10-12. End.